While we are discussing and focusing on the India Revival Mission, it's important to look at the role of corporate India, the private sector and private investments in bringing India back on the revival path. This is incredibly crucial because even as the central government and state governments try and incentivize recovery and economic improvement, it is private consumption and private investment which will boost the way. To speak on this today, I'm joined by Niranjan Hiranandani. I have Dilip Chenoy of FICCI with me on the show, and of course, Amit Kapoor. Amit, give us a sense on how important it is for private enterprise to really come forward. We have seen that the government has ramped up investments to some extent, but many believe that more can be done. Does it now fall to private industry to really forge ahead?
Absolutely, Tamanna. This is an important point because if you really look at it, like there have been a lot of initiatives that the government has actually taken, but now it is the turn for the private sector to move things along. And when you say the private sector, there are of course, given the pandemic, there were a severe sets of crises that the private sector had faced, but now it is time for them really to rev up. Probably, I think they also did a great job in the past in terms of not firing too many people. They were actually able to maintain their staff. So they have done that. They have done a huge service to the country during the times of the pandemic. But now going forward, I think this is the best time to really look at expansion. And when we say expansion, for a simple reason, the way the global economy is shifting, especially when you talk about the global supply chains. And we have also said that in the white paper, that if you're really looking at low-skilled manufacturing, that is where the private sector can actually step in. They look at manufacturing as a new agenda for the future. This is where they look at opportunities across the spectrum. And if they are able to do those sets of things, it's going to be great. The next thing is that this pandemic has said as to how important is it to actually invest in workforce and a resilient workforce and a healthy workforce. So this is where the private sector would also understand that investing in health is actually a competitive advantage for the future, because if we really want to get ready and we want to create that resilience in the system, it would mean that the private sector has to invest in its people and become resilient over a period of time. In fact, that is what the Prime Minister had said yesterday as well, that it is about resilience that we have to look at, than just investing for a disaster or something of that sort. So if you really look at it, this is what private sector can actually do. The other thing is that if you really look at private sector, the private sector can actually enable a lot more in terms of how income generation can actually happen. If they're expanding, then of course income generation is going to improve, and that is actually going to have a catapulting effect or a multiplier effect as we go along. Because it is always going to be the private sector which creates wealth. It's not about anybody else. The private sector has to move ahead and really create the possibilities for themselves. In fact, one of the sectors, if you really look at it, is, say, the real estate, which is already seeing a certain sort of boom. If we are able to move ahead with that, that is going to be having a positive impact as we go along.
You know, which is why I'm so keen to speak with Niranjan Hiranandani on this today, and welcome to the show once again, Niranjan. The question is, and one of the 4 points in this white paper recommendation is empowering low-skilled manufacturing. Now, real estate is a huge employment generator, and the pickup that we've seen in real estate has truly been heartening. But how close are we still to pre-COVID-19 levels? Is this all a relative improvement, and do you see this recovery really sustaining?
Thank you very much, Tamanna, for calling me for this. Let me assure you that real estate has definitely picked up in the last 4 or 5 months, and there's a positive story on that, plus infrastructure. A combination of low skills is really hugely working in this sector, and the skilling is really taking a forward seat. What Amit Kapoor just mentioned about being able to increase the number of people getting employed in this sector is definitely happening. However, there are constraints in these issues that we have, and we think that over a period of time, we would have to address them in order to exponentially grow this further into these sectors. So while we say that the initiatives taken by the Honorable Prime Minister in affordable housing, Mr. Gadkari's push in terms of infrastructure of roads, then ports and other things, I think this sector, which now employs 15% of the entire workforce of India, skilled and unskilled put together, has a great exponential story. Second, I'd like to mention no country in the world has ever done a double-digit growth in GDP without focusing on infrastructure and housing. That's why, with no infrastructure of roads, etc., in Europe or in Japan or in those countries which are already developed, you do not get double-digit GDP growth. You get a smaller GDP growth as compared to India, where all these sectors are definitely carrying on. So we have to focus on it, and I think it can work much more than what we are doing today.
Yeah, and of course, the GDP growth will also depend on the base, which is why we're expected to see an excellent bump up in the next year. But that's because we've had a much lower base due to the pandemic in 2020. Dilip Chenoy, I want to get a sense from you on what is happening in the MSME space. Because large corporates report their results, you have a chance of interaction, and there's more clarity and transparency. One gets a sense that there has been recovery. Corporate numbers have largely been quite comforting. But what is happening outside that limited pocket?
I think the MSMEs, there are two kinds of stories there, and we need to understand the structure of MSMEs to be able to answer, look at the answer in totality. First, there are those MSMEs that have taken loans from the bank that are eligible for the emergency credit guarantee loan scheme, etc., etc. They are actually, they have managed to survive. The second set of MSMEs are those that are not in the formal banking sector, and they used to survive on cash flow month to month. So a lot of those people have actually had, because there's no government program or no state government program for these kinds of businesses. Another type of MSME classification is those that are supplying to essential commodities and manufacturing. Those have actually progressed and grown with the essential commodities and manufacturing. There are a lot of small MSMEs that also cater to the services. People, for example, who create sets for the film industry, sets, or do a lot of work for the banqueting in hotels or something, where the revival has not yet actually happened, and those have been impacted more than the traditional manufacturing in the essential commodities or in the day-to-day requirements that are there. So there are four categories really of MSMEs. The government has taken steps to actually address them. And if you look at the budget of 2021, the outlay for the ministry has actually doubled. But a lot of MSMEs depend on state governments for support. And that state governments, whether it's electricity duty, electricity charges, or other aspect, and of course the perennial challenge of payments to MSMEs, which is always mentioned by MSMEs. So MSMEs really face three challenges. One is demand, second is finance, right? And the third is, getting a cash flow going there. A lot of the MSMEs also have been impacted by the migratory labor, going back, but that is slowly coming back into stream.
I want to focus for a minute on the service sector. We are a service sector reliant economy, and the service sector is yet to really come back into form. Do you think, apart from the recommendations, of course, that you have listed out in the white paper, that more can be done to boost service sector industries?
So, Tamanna, this is a very important question that we have to answer and understand. That if you really look at the services sector, when you talk about, say, hospitality or travel and things, these things will come up, or they will actually revive once the whole pandemic is over. So there is going to be a little bit of a lag in terms of how things happen. But I think there is a larger story in terms of basic services, as what Dilip was saying. There are services which have actually started picking up. Say, like when you talk about people moving from one location to the other within the city. So you have seen that Ubers of the world have actually come up. There are different sets of services which are coming up, wherein the electronic services have actually really come up. So this has also been a time when a lot of people could have actually redefined their businesses. They could have actually looked at newer opportunities. So that is there. But if you really talk to me about hospitality, tourism, travel, it is going to still take some time. And probably the event space, which is going to take some time to rev up. But other things are actually showing a lot of resilience in terms of like how they're really moving forward. And you are already seeing some positive indications.
Absolutely. Mr. Hiranandani, specifically for businesses that are still struggling, and I'm talking not just necessarily the big corporate houses, do you think there is time now come and the time is ripe for more support from the government, or are you now confident that with demand picking up, with the GDP reviving to some extent, that and the vaccinations rolling out, honestly, that there will be a sharp upturn?
My view is that I think government will still have to help and intervene in terms of financial help, in terms of credit availability, and all these other factors. Because as both Mr. Chenoy and Mr. Kapoor just mentioned, there are sectors which are still affected, whether it is in the MSME sector or it is in the hospitality sector. There is huge amount of pain. Now, unless you're not going to take care of that and you allow IBC to open up, which is expected by, I think, before the end of March, where you'll be able to foreclose on the project or the loans which we are talking about, the pain will then get seen on the books of the banks and other financial institutions.
That ties into another point that this white paper makes to improve consumption, and we've spoken about this before, and they sort of go hand in hand. If you want to make India a manufacturing hub and employ a low-cost labor, the output of that will be more income generation and possibly more sustainable consumption demand coming in. Dilip Chenoy, how can this be done? What do you think is the focus that should be a priority right now? Because somewhere along the line, we have stopped talking about how the economy will revive, maybe comforted by the fact that we are in positive territory for this quarter's GDP, but you would agree that there is a long way to go.
I think, when you started the program, you also mentioned that we might have high growth because of the low base. You didn't use these words, but you alluded to it. So I think the right way to look at growth is where do we stand vis-a-vis 1920, right? And if we are going to benchmark ourselves against 1920, and if we say that, do we say that, okay, we're going to grow double the rate that we are going, we're going to not have a washout year, but we're going to actually enable that to grow forward, then demand is a great thing. We have to boost demand. So actually what Mr. Hiranandani talked about, and, you mentioned about the real estate story, the real estate story was boosted by reduction in stamp duty, by, other reduction in interest rates. There was a lot of demand spurring activity there. Similarly, the voucher idea, which is in the white paper, and this is what Vicky has also been advocating, that we need to encourage people to spend. There have to be demand stimulation measures, a combination of the voucher, possibly limited reduction of GST for a limited period of time, reduced interest rates for a limited period of time to go and spend, and also enhancing some income tax exemptions for spending when you go forward here. That would actually keep the demand going, which is important, because currently a lot of people are saying it is pent up demand. It is not necessarily fresh demand which is coming in, and to get the growth story going, we need to double the demand going forward.
Very, very rightly put. We also have to understand the linkages between these discretionary spends and where the vaccine and the COVID-19 waves are moving and how fast the vaccinations are rolling out. Amit, I'd like you to put this into perspective, because as we were developing this white paper, it seemed like the worst was behind us. But as we're speaking today, you have cases spiking once more. Do you think that this could be a dampener?
There is a lot of learning that is actually accrued in the last 12 months in terms of like how lockdowns were actually done and instituted. At this point in time, I think we are not going to be looking at a severe lockdown or a clampdown as which actually had happened in May, because that was the need of the hour at that time. But now we have a huge learning behind us. So you will actually see some very tactical lockdowns that you would see. So it is not going to be a dampener that in terms of like you are coming to a complete standstill. You might have some restrictions on a certain set of activities, which is an important thing, that people are not congregating at one place or whatever, or huge congregations don't happen, or there is absolutely a spike that happens. But given what we are seeing, we have a huge learning from how the medical practice can be really taken up, or how we can take care of people. So that means it is not going to be brutal in its impact. What I'm really seeing is that in the next, because the vaccination has started, we are actually going to be seeing a downward curve on these infections and the upward kick on the economy in the coming 6 months. And it is going to be fairly positive. In fact, moving on from what Dilip was saying, I'm very, very positive that India is actually going to see a fairly huge growth over a period of time. In fact, when you're talking about, say, if we can we come to 2019 levels? Yes, we will, and we will actually come there fairly fast. And that evidence is already clearly available from certain set of industries, that they're already at about 90% of previous year sales. So that means that resilience actually exists, and we can move ahead on that factor.
Well, let's hope for the best. Let's hope for the best. The India Revival Mission cheers on, tracks, and boosts India's revival story. We speak to and bring to you voices from the top experts who can talk about how we can get to this mission that we all need to be on. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us today.